Good morning, everyone. It is the 19th of Mar Cheshvan, the 3rd of November, 5784 in 2023. And we are in the second part of our shiur dealing with the responsibility or the privilege or the correctness of Torah Yeshiva students engaging in battle. Historically in the Tanakh, there was always Jewish soldiers that were scholars. The Torah talks about going to war. The Torah talks about having the best religious people involved in battle. A Jewish war is meant to be a holy war. It's meant to be done for the sake of heaven, to bring back the eternal people into their rightful place with security. It's meant to uphold religion. And we've spoken about all these sources in the Rambam in last week's class. And in the Tanakh, we never see any hesitation in times of battle that there's exemptions for certain groups because of religious status. And as we approach and try to understand today's exemptions that the government of Israel recognizes, and it's under presently, but it's under in debate, we wanted to explore the literature, the halacha, the discussions, the values that are mentioned throughout the Shas, the Talmud, and become familiar with them and reserve judgment, but just to learn the subject. And then once we have clarity on the material, the academic material, and then try to bridge the gap and transition into understanding how it should or could be applied to the modern era with all of its interesting, peculiar changes that may make it not similar to the way things were yesteryear in the past. So right now we're just learning Torah, and what we discussed is the powers of Torah learning, the powers of prayer that are found in the Talmud that help, but we haven't found that it's to be done at the exception of fighting. There's one source in the Gemara in Eruvin that tells us about Yoshua. We saw this last week. How Yoshua was held accountable and a punishment was about to happen. There was an angel with a sword in a vision that he had, and he said it's because of they didn't study Torah, and the explanation of the Talmud was that during the day when you're battling, fight, and you're exempt from Torah study. At nighttime, when you're relaxing and you're not fighting, at that point you should be involved in Torah study. So it seems to be a balance of the two. We saw that there's a value in both, and we tried to understand where is there a possible exemption. We explored the topic of the tribe of Levi that did not have a section of the land, and the Rambam teaches us at the end of Shemitah V'Yovel that Shevet Levi is not meant to work to support themselves. They're provided for by the entire community. 1/10 of all of the produce of the country is given over to the tribe of Levi, and they're also given territories to live in. And another advantage that they have is that they don't go to war. And then the Rambam tells us not only Shevet Levi can afford themselves of this situation where they don't have to work, anybody who wishes to dedicate their lives to a spiritual connection to Hashem and focus on academia of Torah study and teaching, they can benefit from the gift of Hashem that Hashem will provide for them. Not that you can throw yourself on the people and require them to pay for you, but if you have enough trust in Hashem and you're sincere with your way of life, then Hashem will make sure to provide for you your basic minimal level. What the Rambam doesn't add in is that you don't need that. He doesn't say that just like Shevet Levi doesn't go to war, the Talmid Chacham, who's dedicated his life, doesn't need to go to war. And that was left as a question, is it similar in that way or not? But that was a potential source. And then we had discussions about how could it be even to say that Shevet Levi, the tribe of Levi, is exempt from going to war, where we have halachic sources that discuss Shevet Levi in battle. He is allowed to have take advantage of the license for a Yifat Torah, take a captive woman as his wife. If he didn't marry in a halachically appropriate way, like a kohen to a divorcee, then he doesn't have the exemption of the first year of marriage to go home. But we see that he is in battle. And through a course of such questions and similar questions, we came to a number of responses by the Roshei Yeshivot, the leaders of the Torah academies who have given the contemporary, in the past century, have given different explanations to this. And we learned that it is possible for a person to a Shevet Levi to voluntarily join the army. According to the Tribuna Rov, the Shevet Levi are expected to be in the army, but not in a kravi. They're not meant to be warriors, fighters, but to be suppliers. And then the other interpretation given by the Brisker Rav is that they're exempt as long as there's enough manpower. But as soon as there's a war and you need to have every able-bodied, then you are expected, even Shevet Levi is expected to join. And even if we are to extend this discussion to the Torah scholars, those still would be those same restrictions, those same obligations would still be on them as well. Okay, that's what we did up until now. And now I'd like to continue on with some more material about this, and that is, it seems to be a section in the Gemara in Sota, Daf Yud Amud Aleph, where the Gemara seems to indicate that it is inappropriate to draft Talmidei Chachamim, Torah scholars, into the army. What does the Gemara say? It talks about Asa, the king of Yehuda. The king of Yehuda, after there was a certain period of time where we had one king, Shaul, David, Shlomo, and then after Shlomo, the kingdom of Klal Yisrael was split into two. Malchei Yehuda, Malchei Yisrael. Two lines. And at times they didn't get along with each other. There were those in the area of Yehuda, where around Jerusalem area, and then in the north, where the Malchei Yisrael, the north of the country. And they didn't get along and they fought. One of those kings, of the kings of Yehuda, his name was Asa. And it says in the Navi, in Malachim, Aleph, chapter 15, verse 22, it talks about Asa, that he had drafted the Talmidei Chachamim, the soldiers, when he was fighting the king of Yisrael. And he was punished for doing so. And the Gemara in Sota says that, he quotes the verse, Va'melech Asa hishmiat kol Yehuda ein naki. He drafted, he said, every able body needs to come, and no one is free from this war. Everybody needs to come, even if you just got married, a groom, a bride, everybody needed to come. And he also drafted the Talmidei Chachamim, and he was punished for that. It would seem to indicate from that Gemara, on the surface reading, that you're not supposed to be drafting Torah scholars. And because he used them for war. And it seems that they are exempt from going to war. But if you look carefully in the sources of that section in Sota and in the Tanakh, it is clear that it was not during the war. It was after the war was over, and he had built ramps and support for his siege on the cities. And after the war was over, he wanted to remove them. He wanted to bring the streets back to the way they were. It's called, he wanted to take off a ramah. There was some kind of ramp. And then he was in violation of the pasuk Naki Yeh Lebeito, that people that just got married and Talmidei Chacham are exempt. So here we see that when it's not during wartime, that is when there's an exemption to the yeshiva students, so to speak, the Talmudic scholars, which seems to somewhat support the Brisker Rav's notion as well. And the Maharshap adds that explanation that when it's not during war, then you shouldn't be bringing Talmidei Chachamim. But if it is wartime, then it should be okay. And the Karen Ora, another commentary on that Gemara, Mem Daled, actually points out specifically that during wartime, even Talmidei Chachamim should be brought to the draft and should be part of the war effort. So that started off as a support that people may use to exempt yeshiva students, but in fact, it turns out to be a source to require yeshiva students to join the war effort, at least during wartime. There's another Gemara in Nidarim, Lamed Beis Amud Aleph, and it talks about Avram Avinu. Why was Avram Avinu punished that his progeny would have to go into exile for 210 years in Egypt? And the Talmud says, Al Sha'asa Angaria B'Talmidei Chachamim, that he drafted a Torah scholar into his war, as it says in the pasuk which we read last week, Vayarek es Chanichav. He drafted his prime student Eliezer into the war in order to fight the kings and to get Lot back. And again, on the face of it, it would look like you shouldn't be drafting yeshiva students, but after careful study, one can also suggest over there that did not have the halachic status of a milchemet mitzvah. Okay, Lot was not recognized at that time as Jewish. If anything, Lot had turned away from Hashem. Vayisa Lot bikedem, Rashi tells us in chapter 13, verse 11, Hisia atatzmo mikadmono shel olam. He said, Ifshi ba'Avraham uve'elohav. Lot had declared, I'm not interested in Avram's approach to life. I'm not interested in Avram's God. He turned away from God. And therefore, he was not considered, he was considered someone that you don't need to go to battle for. It's not a Mechemet mitzvah. Avram did it because of his personal commitments to his relative. But under those circumstances, a Talmid Chacham does not need to go like we made that distinction. And then there's another source in Sanhedrin, 49a, Mem Tes Amud Aleph, where the Talmud dissects and understands a section of the Navi. There was a general of the army called Amasa. Amasa was the warrior general, the Ramatkal, as they would call today in modern Tzahal, of David's army. And David had told Amasa, I want you to draft everybody, I'm going to battle. And he called all the Bnei Yehuda and all the soldiers. And when Amasa got there to one section, as calling in the draft, he saw a group of students that were studying. They were learning a Masechet, actually. And he didn't want to disturb them. Yoav heard about it. Yoav, who was also one of the leaders for David's monarchy, and Yoav killed Amasa. This is all in the Nach, because he was mored b'malchut. He went against the edict of the king. And it would seem from here that if there is no edict of the king, you weren't violating the edict of the king, because you're called mored b'malchut if the king says something you don't follow. And that's why Amasa was killed. But if there wouldn't have been that thing, then apparently what Amasa did was acceptable. And if you see students learning in yeshiva, you shouldn't be drafting them. So that would, again, might be a support for this notion to have an exemption for yeshiva students. But again, that can be refuted, because if you study that scene carefully, this was not a mechemet mitzvah. What David HaMelech wanted to do, he wanted to recapture a man called Sheva bin Bichri, who himself was not a good person. He was a mored b'malchut. He had gone against the word of the king. and there was no obligation on soldiers, on other people to enter into such a battle to save him, and therefore it was not considered a mechemet mitzvah, and that's why Talmidei Chachamim would be exempt, were it not for the fact that David had made the order, and that's what Amasa. And like I mentioned, we have this point. So we've tried to bring sources, or some sources that seem to indicate on the surface that yeshiva students are exempt. But each of those cases, we drew the line and we said it depends. If it's a mechemet mitzvah, if you're expected to go to war, there's a mitzvah to go to war, then even Talmidei Chachamim should go. If it's not a mechemet mitzvah, then you are exempt if you are a yeshiva student. And that brings us back to that section in the Megillah that we saw where Yehoshua, Megillah Daf Gimel Med Aleph, that tells us Yeshua was held accountable that even the soldiers that he had gone to war, okay, and they were expected to learn Torah at nighttime when they weren't fighting. So that is some of the sources that are found in the Talmud. Now I want to jump to a contemporary question that when I was a kid and I came to Israel, I came first in 1977. I went to high school here. I was debating, my parents were debating whether or not to send me to a Jewish high school in Tel Aviv or in Jerusalem. In the end, I went to a high school in Tel Aviv. The other school that I was considering and I applied for, my parents didn't want me to go to in the end, was called Netiv Meir. Around that time that I would have been in that school, a letter was written by two high school students from Netiv Meir to Rav Moshe Feinstein. And they were planning their lives. They were finishing high school and they were considering whether or not they should stay in yeshiva and study Torah or join the army. Two kids, probably 17 years old, wrote a letter to Rav Moshe Feinstein, one of the Gedolei Hador, who was in America at the time. And we are fortunate to have this response of Rav Moshe Feinstein, who was at that time considered the indisputable leader of the Jewish people in the world, here in Israel and abroad. And it's found, if you want to look at it yourself, I'll show you where it is. It's in Yoreh Deah Chelik Dalid, Siman Lamed Gimel. The response of Rav Moshe is as follows. I'm going to try to dissect it and analyze his statement. He says, going to the army is a very valuable thing to do. But learning Torah, for those that actually, I'm loosely translating, for those that are involved in the study of Torah, is even greater value, and also for the protection of the country. And he brings a source for this, and he brings a source that I did not yet mention. It's interesting, we're going to explore his source. He says that, take a look in the Talmud in Baba Basra, Daf Chet. It says that if you have a city that needs to have protection, they need to put up a wall to protect themselves from bandits, people that are going to come in and steal, which would be the applicable thing if you want to put up locks, you want to put up some type of security system to avoid theft. So it says in the Talmud that if you have a community that needs to have some type of security, everybody has to chip in equally, except for the Torah scholars. That's the Gemara in Baba Basra Daf Ches Amud Aleph. Rabbanan lo tzrichi nitirusa. Talmidei Chachamim don't need protection. And therefore, says Rav Moshe Feinstein, he's comparing a law that's found in Choshen Mishpat. It's found in the Rambam as well. This Perek Vav of Shchenim, Halacha Hey. Talmidei Chachamim, the Rambam says, Ein tzrichin shmira, shat Torah shomratan. The Torah is the thing that protects them. Says Rav Moshe Feinstein, if a Talmid Chacham is exempt from paying the security fees because his Torah protects him, then a person who's in the Yeshiva Gedola is exempt from going to the army, and therefore a person who has a strong desire to learn Torah and to become a great Torah leader and a great Talmid Chacham and filled with Yirat Shamayim, he should decide to go to the yeshivot instead of the army, and that will bring a blessing to the Jewish people and bring protection to the entire nation. That is the short version, a translation of Rav Moshe's tshuva, his responsa. From the year that it was written in, it wasn't a year where there was a battle, there was a war going on. But here he says that the Talmid Chacham are exempt, but he adds in this new concept of protection that the Torah gives, and he brings a different source. Okay? So let's explore this source that he brings in and see if it really is applicable. And I have the utmost respect for Moshe Feinstein. I'm sure I've quoted him many times in my classes in the past. I know. But nevertheless, Torah hi v'lil mod ani tzarech. Let us explore and see what our intellectual honesty and capacity has questions or tries to understand. And that's the nature of Torah. Somebody says something, we discuss it, we challenge it, and we see if it sits well, and we understand it. At the end of the day, Torah was given to human beings, and they're expected to try to understand it as best they can. And that's what Rav Moshe himself, in his introduction to his Igrot, actually writes. He says, I want you to read this, I want you to evaluate it on its own merit, and if you like it, accept it, and if you don't like it, reject it. That's Rav Moshe's opening intro to all of his writings in halacha. So, studying this halacha in Choshen Mishpat, that a Talmid Chacham doesn't need to pay for the security, I am familiar with the Radvaz. There's a Reb David ben Zimra who lived in Egypt and in Israel. In his second Chelik Bet, Siman Tafshin Nun Bet, he makes the following comment on that halacha. He says, true, the Talmud says, Rabbanan lo tzrichin tirusa. They don't need protection. He says, there are two things that need to be understood about that Gemara. A, the Gemara is only talking about security from theft, not when there is danger to life. A, if there's danger to life then, and you need security for that, then even the Talmid Chachamim need to pay. And B, even when it's dealing with danger for theft, that is when the Talmid Chacham feels, you know what? I believe in the Torah. I believe in the power of the protection that is given to the Talmidei Chachamim, and therefore I'm not concerned about the danger of theft, and I don't want to pay for it because I'm going to be relying upon my Torah. However, says the Radvaz, and this is going back hundreds of years ago, he wrote this commentary. He's in 1400s about. And he says, if the Talmid Chacham is actually concerned, not only for his physical safety, which in general we don't have an exemption according to Radvaz, but even for his property, he's concerned and he says, oh, I'm so happy that you have a wall around the city. I'm so happy that there's protection. I'm so happy you're hiring a security company, security guards to protect the community. I love it. If he's happy about it and he's concerned without them, then he needs to pay. The only argument of the Talmud is if you are relying on your Torah and you're not at all concerned, then you're exempt. And therefore, a judgment, if imagine you have cap going around and the person says, you know what, I don't need cap. I'm comfortable. I'm relying on my Torah study to protect me. Then it could be a discussion if you can apply that to Talmud or not. And even then, if it's a matter of, are you concerned about theft or are you concerned about your life? The Radvaz would say, if you're concerned about your life, then I don't care what you say, you have to pay. And if you're just concerned about theft and you say, I'm relying on my Torah, then you'll be exempt. But if you're happy that cap is going around, then you need to pay. That's the Radvaz's point. If that's true, then when you apply it to the situation, if you'd have the Torah students who say, you know what, we're not worried about theft because of our Torah, then fine. But first of all, the issue is not just theft. The issue is much worse than that. The issue is concern for your own safety, your life, in which case there is no exemption in the Gemara on that. A. B, if you're also concerned about the dangers involved and you're worried and you're happy that there's an army there, then again, according to that source would not be sufficient. And there's a book written by Yitzhak Zilberstein. The name of the book is Chashuke Chemed. On his commentary on the Talmud Bab Metzia, he said the name of his was a relative of his. He says, in the place where there's concern of pikuach nefesh, He says, we don't say Labanan lo tzricha nitusa, which was the same thing in Radvaz. The Radvaz is not talking about theft, but if you're concerned about safety to life, then you don't apply the rule Rabbanan lo tzricha nitusa. Okay, it's only from gnevot, it's only from theft, and then you could say that's point number one. He says you could say, I'm not worried that there will be a problem of theft. He says, but that is also only if the problem hasn't already begun. You say, I don't expect it to happen. But if it already is a theft problem and they're coming in, at that point, you cannot rely on a miracle. And even Talmidei Chachamim need to pay for the security. In other words, if there was security, there was a breach of the security, and the Arabs or the non-Jews or the blacks are able to come into the homes and to steal, and they're already doing it, at that point, there's no place to rely on it. It's reported that someone was giving a Torah class, with a group of people, and the sirens went off, and some people wanted to run in, and some said, we're learning Torah, we were protected. And they went to ask Rabbi Yashiv what to do. What should we do if the siren goes off? And he says, of course, under those circumstances, everybody needs to run to a shelter and protect themselves. It's a matter of pikuach nefesh, and it's a matter as if there's already the rockets are incoming, and therefore both of those reasons you cannot hide under the protection of Torah. So those are some of the sources. There's another section that's found in the Talmud that seems to indicate that Torah can protect and heal. I don't know if we should pause here and go to. There's another section in the Talmud that seems to support this idea that Torah study protects and saves. We brought the source from Rav Moshe Feinstein, his sources. We actually challenged it, but there's another section in the Gemara in Sota, Daf Chaf Aleph Amid Aleph, 21a. The section in Sota is talking about two interesting, special people in Tanakh, Doeg and Achitophel. They were people in the time of King David HaMelech, actually not good people. They were Torah scholars, very learned, but they made some bad choices in life. And the Talmud says, why did these two people die such terrible, unnatural deaths? Doeg died an unnatural death, it seemed, earlier than his time should be. Achitophel did as well. Achitophel actually committed suicide. Take a look in Shmuel Bet, chapter 17:23. And they died at ages 34 and 36, respectively. And the Talmud says, Milo aski batorah? Did these two people, did they not study Torah? Why did Torah, amaylo higina alayhu? Why did the Torah study not protect them? And the Gemara makes a comment and says, Torah, magna umatzla. It's Aramaic for magen umatzil, protects and saves. And if they were Torah scholars, why was it not protective of them? And interesting, the Gemara is talking about two people that were evil, but they were studying Torah, and still the Gemara asks the question. So the Gemara, Amar Rava, the Torah teacher in the Talmud, says the following. At the time one is studying Torah, magenu matzil, it protects and it saves. At the time that if a person had been studying Torah in the past, then it just magen velo matzil. It protects, but doesn't save. And therefore, they needed to die. The Maharsha, the commentary on the Gemara there, says, I don't understand. But you're telling me that Doeg and Achitophel were academics, were Talmidei Chachamim, and they had studied Torah. So even if they weren't studying Torah now, but it still should be magen, it should still protect them. So why did they die these unnatural deaths at 34 and 36 years old? Explains the Maharsha on the commentary of the Gemara. When we say it protects, it means that a person is protected from suffering and punishment, but not from death. You still may end up dying. V'kal lavin, it says it's very easy to understand that distinction. If a person is in the middle of the studying of Torah, then it protects and it also saves, and you won't end up dying. And as we all know the stories that when the Yetzer Hara, when the Malach HaMavis tries to get people, he needs to first have them stop their studying of Torah, either when they're sleeping, or if you're familiar with the story of King David, he always tried to be studying Torah in order that the Malach HaMavis shouldn't attack him. But there was one time he was walking up the staircase, and one of the stairs broke, and he slipped for a moment, and he lost his train of thought. And at that moment, when he stopped his studying of Torah, his life was taken at 70 years old. But that's the one point of the Gemara which we see that the Gemara does seem to say that at the time a person is studying Torah, his life cannot be taken. And that is an interesting, powerful thing. But that doesn't mean that the person, all you need to have is a situation where he momentarily stops and then his life could be taken, A. And B, all that is for that person itself. But we don't see from this Talmud section that it protects the entire population, entire other people. But what's interesting to note, as I referred to, is that this covers even people if they're sinners. They've made bad choices and they've stood against Hashem in many ways. But nevertheless, the study of Torah has that power. Okay. The Talmud actually goes on to talk about mitzvot and says mitzvot, when a person is doing an act of a mitzvah, eating matzah, giving tzedakah, that is something that protects all the time, but it does not matzil, it does not save you from death. So that would be another source, again, which cannot be used in any way to exempt yeshiva students from the army. And then to add to that, there's a section in the Gemara in Talmud, in Ksuvos, Ayin Zayin Amid Aleph. It says, only those people that are learning Torah on a very high level, the Shem Shamayim, for the right motivations, only those people are going to merit to have protection. So we say that Torah protects is for people that are studying Torah and also with the right motivation. And over there it's talking about being protected from a plague, from a pandemic. And there were certain people, certain Amoraim, we may have actually learned this together during Corona. There were certain Amoraim who had taken measures to protect themselves from being infected, and others didn't. And there was a discussion over there is whether or not their Torah can protect them. And it's other sources as well emphasize this distinction. So it's not just any study of Torah, it's study of Torah of the highest level. There's a book called Torah Chaim in his commentary above Metzia Pehayim and Aleph that makes this distinction. And it's also referred to in the book Or HaChaim HaKadosh, which was a commentary on the Torah in the beginning of Parshas Bechukosai, that the Torah and this toil of Torah, the study of Torah protects a person is only with the correct motivations. Okay? So there is another source which I think is worthwhile to mention, and that is the Rambam in the second chapter of Talmud Torah. He tells us that you need to establish schools for the children to study Torah in every single city. He says, "She'en ha'olam mitkayem evel ela behevel piem shel tinokot shel beit rabban." The entire world is supported through the pure Torah study of children who have not come to the ages where they are tempted to sin and they haven't made bad choices. They don't even have the free will, the choices, the cognizance, the consciousness to know right and wrong. They don't not consider as if they have dat and enough maturity. So they're not held accountable for many of their sins, but they do have the benefit of their Torah study. Their Torah study is considered pure because of it. And the Torah study of children in particular is really powerful, says the Rambam, and the entire world continues existing. If we do find a particular power in the study of Torah, it would probably be found in the pure Torah of children, and as much as possible to keep the schools going. That might be, but if you're dealing with adults, able-bodied soldiers during the time of war, that is not something which we find an exemption for. But children who don't go to battle anyway, that is, if there's anything that we can find an exemption for, it should be for them. And so let's just going to bring a few more sources about the integration of these two elements. the need for battle, the need for people to go to protect themselves physically from an enemy, to have an army, to have weapons, to have a line of defense, and also to have the power of Torah study that does protect. Both these things are important, and they actually need to work together in an integrated form. That's what seems to be from other sources than Talmud. In Sanhedrin, Mem Tes Amud Aleph, it says, were it not for David, Yoav would not be able to go to battle and to be the Ramatkal, the general. If it was not for Yoav, David HaMelech wouldn't be able to study Torah. In other words, David was considered the pillar of study of Torah. Yoav was considered the general in the army. And if one didn't do his job, the other couldn't do their job. The Gemara seems to say, let's have a healthy balance between those that go to war and those that are studying Torah. And the Talmud goes, I'm just going to say some of the phrases. Why is it that Matam David Oseh Mishpat Utzedakah L'chol Amo? Why was he able to study Torah, do mitzvot, do justice, run courts for the entire nation? Because Yoav was al tzava. Why was Yoav al tzava? Because David was Oseh Mishpat Utzedakah L'chol Amo. You need to have, the Gemara seems to point out that let's have a balance of both things. Another source is found in the Gemara in Makos, Daf Yud Amud Aleph, Amar B'Yeshua ben Levi. And he quotes the pasuk in Tehillim, which I hope we're all familiar with. Omdos hayu ragleinu b'sharayach Yushalayim. We were standing by the gates of Jerusalem, wanting to come in to do a service and to praise Hashem. But the Gemara takes it the following way. What helped me, garam leragleinu she'amdu b'milchama? What helped us stand in battle? The fact that they were studying Torah in the gates of Yerushalayim, that helped them in battle. So again, you see the balance between going to the success in war is going to be supported by the study of Torah. We do see that seems that there should be a need for people to be in the battle. You also need to have a part of the nation that is able to be involved in the Torah study, and that is a natural interest to have both elements. Our question is, should you take able-bodied soldiers and exclusively put them into Beis Medrash and study Torah? Maybe it should be relegated to those that children or adults or women or somebody else who's not able to go to be a person in battle, a warrior. And maybe there should be an exemption only when it's not a state of war and they're not needed. For the personnel is not needed. And therefore, it would seem, putting all this information together, we've just learned a lot of the sources, and I've given you the places where to continue doing your own research. But it seems that someone who is able to be extremely successful in his study of Torah and to learn without interruption, in order that he end up being a great Torah scholar, and it does not stand in the way of the national interest to hold an army. In other words, the army doesn't need them right now. Then there may be basis to push off the draft for those Torah students. And then it would give the spiritual power to the Jewish people. But if they're needed for the army, if they're needed for that, and it seems I have not yet found a source in the literature under utopian situation where they should be exempt. On the contrary, it seems that they should be there. What has to be considered is, how could that be done? How should that be done in a practical way? Just thinking on the surface, if you take yeshiva students 2-3 years out of their life at that formative age and you put them in the training with the army, with a group of people that are lacking the same spiritual level and the different values, you could be changing the trajectory of that person's life and generations in a very significant way. And some solutions need to be found for that, I believe. That's one of the issues that could come up. And I just want to point out that there's one more source that I want to conclude with, and that is anybody who is a warrior and is fighting to protect the Jewish people is one of the most holiest places that could be. The section in the Gemara in Bava Basra, Yudam and Beis, tells us, Haruge Lud, Ein kol beria yachol la'amod b'mechitzatan. There were certain people who had given their lives in order to save the Jewish community. They volunteered. They didn't need to do that. And the Talmud says the place in heaven for those people who join in and willingly try to protect the Jewish people, they reach the highest places in Shamayim, and no one can stand in their section because they have given their lives for this great cause of the Netzach Yisrael, the eternal Jewish people, which is an expression of God here in this world. Is there any comments, questions that any of you may have?
Thank you very much for a wonderful shir.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Rav.
Okay.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Thank
Shabbat
you,
shalom.
everyone.
Okay, all the best. Be well. Bye.